Welcome back. Today we're going to be looking at sweat soldering, the process of a two-part soldering where you solder the surface of a metal to the surface of a metal. So we're going to use this in a little bit to demonstrate it. But here are some examples. This overlay hangs off the side of the base. This overlay is self-contained within the base. And this overlay right here shares some common edges with the base. This one, even though technically is a surface-to-surface, this piece is thin enough to where it was soldered, it was just done by a chip soldering. So there are exceptions to that with the surface-to-surface soldering. One thing you want to be careful of is if you are using a textured material, that can get a little weird because the primary goal before you get started is to make sure these two pieces fit flush together. And if they don't fit flush together, go ahead and use a leather mallet and a steel block to make that happen. If you're working with a curved surface, that gets a little trickier. This piece right here is not particularly flat, plus it's got a lot of texture on there, so that's going to be a really tough one to do and get that soldered down. So we're not going to be working on something like that. We're going to be working with this right here. So it's going to be done in two parts. You've got your overlay and your base piece, and you're going to be puddling solder to the back side of your overlay. And here's some different examples of what that's going to look like when you're finished. And then here are a couple examples again of once it's flipped and soldered down to the base, what it might look like there. So we're going to go ahead and get started with setting up the solder. So I'm working with my overlay, and I'm going to do the back side of the piece. I'm going to just put away my base layer for now because during the part A you don't want to worry about your base layer at all. So as always, I'm going to coat this with flux to protect the metal. If you have sterling, be really careful about making sure both sides are coated. I'm going to go ahead and come in with my toothpick now. I've pre-cut these solder chips. I am using medium. It's my only solder seam, so I don't have to worry too much about the melting temperature on this. And I'm just laying them down. If you're having a hard time getting these where you want them, keep in mind that too much flux on your toothpick is going to cause some problems, and not enough will not let you pick these guys up. So you're going to lay them, it's almost like connect the dots. You want a little bit of space between. You'll notice these are a little bigger than the ones that we cut for our wire solder seams because the surface is a little bigger. And then I'm going to put one in the middle. I didn't want to come up, so I'm going to throw some flux on there, and then I can move that around. And now that's ready to go heat and puddle the solder on the back side. If I'm setting flux up on something, or sorry, solder on something like this, when I come in here, I'm going to lay solder chips all the way around, and in the wide areas, I might end up with two pieces of solder. And it's really important that you have solder around your edges at minimum, and then across the whole thing if you want to be really secure with that solder seam. So we're now at the soldering station ready to puddle the solder on the back side of our overlay. Just a reminder, your base piece is not going to be used during this part of it, so we'll just put that away for now. Just as a reminder, when you're lighting your torch, we're going to start with the gas, a little, not quite a quarter of a turn with this igniter. Upside down with the handle works best. Because we are working on part A, the little piece of metal, the overlays tend to be smaller. You want to work with that 1 to 2 inch flame. If you have a larger overlay, go ahead with a 3 or 4 inch flame. Now I'm going to slowly add my air until I get that kind of crisp internal blue cone. I'm going to go ahead and make sure that my solder pick is on my opposite hand side. I'm going to hold this like a pencil, so the torch handle, and I'm going to come down, and again I'm going to pass over just in X's. Now that flux is white, so it's dried off pretty much all the way, so I can get pretty close, and this is going to go really quickly. The idea is I'm just going to heat up around it, and I want to use the tip of the cone to heat up and spiral to the middle and spiral to the outside, depending on the shape that you have. You want to remove the heat as soon as those solder chips start to puddle, and that's about ready to happen. So these little mounds of solder, so as they start to kind of collapse on themselves, if you evenly heat that, that goes really, really fast. If you have a larger piece or you have an awkward shaped piece, sometimes if you just circle around the solder chips as you go in a line rather than in a circle, that works as well. So going backwards, turning the torch off, air first so that you can watch that gas flame. Hug the block. Copper tongs. Sometimes there's a lot of flux on here. Need your solder pick to help you get that off. Quench it all the way under, and then you're ready to get this pickled for part B. So I have this right here, and my solder is attached to the surface. It's not going anywhere. And then I am going to do part B, which is setting it solder side down. And then I'm going to turn that solder to liquid. I'm going to reheat it, and that will be part B. So now we're ready to do part B of the sweat soldering technique. So the overlay right here has solder puddled on the back side of it. Both pieces have flux on them. And now I'm ready to actually heat. And the rule of thumb with heating to turn this to liquid is you want to have the heat rise. So you're really heating the base level of this. And I don't have a lot of metal that I can see on the base layer, so it's a little bit trickier to heat. If you have a lot of metal that is on your overlay, it's a little bit easier to heat that and then come a little bit closer to your piece. If you have a large overlay, sometimes you have to heat the top of that as well. It's all about bringing both pieces up to temperature at the same time. Now, because you have a little bit more metal than part A, your flame is going to be a little bit bigger. So I'm just going to go ahead and work with a 3-inch flame here. Slowly add my air. And when I go to dry this, I want to make sure that as I'm drying that, the flux doesn't bubble. So see how that moved off? If you let that flux kind of dry, so I'm a little bit too close, so I would just pull back. So I'm just raised my torch a little bit. I also use my solder pick to move that overlay back into place. If it dries on you and you move your heat and you go to move that, remember that one of the functions of flux is to hold it in place. So you might have to kind of think about setting up again if the flux is already dry, or you can just kind of heat it and move it as you go. So I'm now working with the hottest part of my flame. It's going to go fairly quickly. I will see a thin silver line. I can also turn my annealing pan so I see all the way around. Building up heat on that outside edge. I'm going to slow it down a little bit. So now I'm catching both edges, and that just dropped. And I had a thin line just go. And for smaller pieces, and I can look and I can turn, and I see that line. You want to keep your heat on and turn it if you don't know that it flowed all the way. I happened to watch that entire thing sink down at the same time, so I was okay. But you don't want to remove your heat and then kind of look at it and then bring it back, because all you're doing is building up fire scale in there. So once you're finished with that, backwards again, air and then gas. You have to use your copper tongs to quench. All the way under. And now I have my piece, which is completely soldered down. So again, sweat soldering is surface to surface. I did it in a part A and a part B. From here, I'm going to go ahead and pickle it. And as a reminder that after you finish part A, don't forget to pickle that piece before you go to part B. Until next time.